Wow, what an environment you're in there. I am so jealous right now.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's my backyard.
Oh, amazing. This is my backyard right here.
Are you in LA or are you in Mexico City?
No, I'm in Mexico City. Yeah.
Okay, great. I've been to Mexico, but I've never been to Mexico City.
Oh, you have to come. It's a very dynamic city. It's more like New York City in the 1980s. So.
Yeah, I've heard great things about it.
So you just recently moved, or?
Yes, moved from New York City to Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where are you in Connecticut?
We're about 45 minutes outside the city, outside Manhattan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I lived in Connecticut for 6 months. I did a job for a college there. So it was a beautiful, beautiful place.
Yeah, it's a beautiful state, and it's so close to New York, but pretty easy to feel like you're away in a little oasis.
Right, right. So how are you holding up during the quarantines? It seems like you've had a lot of transitions and things, but have you been able to do any work during the quarantine, or?
A little bit. Work's been slow, but I'm glad that I'm not in the city anymore. So daily life hasn't changed that much. I had always been a bit of a germaphobe, so I've always washed my hands religiously anyways.
Right.
What about for you?
Well, I mean, other than not having artists coming through and no like physical events in the space and stuff,
Yeah.
My reality is pretty much the same as it was. I just continue working in my studio.
Yeah, for sure.
We're so excited to have you in the Existimos show. I love your work. You have a wide variety of different topics and things, but I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the significance of the series that is presented in our show and how that came about and what you're hoping for people to get from that series of work as well. Okay.
Yes. So I did this series, Kings and Queens in Their Castles, as a documentary of the LGBTQ experience in the United States. And this is a second book published by Damiani, the Italian publisher. It's portraits of people at home from 30 different states across the United States, from all different walks of life. And I started because I felt like I had seen a lot of gay photography throughout my life, but it always felt very sexualized and kind of graphic. And I wanted to do a documentary of the community that would portray us kind of in everyday situations without being overly sexual. I felt like when I started the project, there hadn't been a huge amount of documentaries of the LGBTQ community. I also felt like a lot of the work I saw was very urban. And although I have lived in cities most of my adult life, I grew up in a small town in Vermont on a dirt road and knew that there were a lot of LGBTQ people living across the country in very small towns, if not in entirely remote and rural places. So I wanted to include those voices and those stories in the series. And then I chose to photograph people in everyday life because I feel like you can get a good sense of what someone's like through seeing their everyday environment and seeing how they interact with their environment. So I also wanted to portray just sort of the diversity and breadth of the community. So I have people of all different sexual identities, people of all different backgrounds, races, and ages in the series. The other thing I noticed when looking at other LGBTQ work is that it seemed to skew younger. So it seemed to not only be a little bit sexualized, but also have a lot of kind of beautiful young bodies, you know, lounging on the beach or what have you. And I made a concerted effort to include a lot of elderly people in the series and people of all ages. So that was something I kind of wanted to do from the start.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that it's not just, well, we tried in the show actually to avoid over-sexualizing because that feels to me like a very retro perspective on the queer experience and something that we did. I think as a result of like the AIDS crisis in the 80s and the 90s, we focused so much on sexuality, but the story of the queer community is so diverse and represents urban and rural and, you know, suburban and age groups. And, you know, so I think that that's a really important thing. How did you go about finding your subject matter? Are these people that you already knew?
Yeah, I started out photographing people I knew and then asking all of my friends and asking friends of friends for referrals. And for the first year or so, a lot of the people I shot were referrals. When I started to travel and I went to 30 different states, I often didn't know people in a lot of these places. So, I mean, a lot of times I would start by asking someone I knew from, say, Texas, if they knew of anybody. But when it came to places like Oklahoma City and Utah, even Colorado, I didn't personally know a lot of people there. So I did a lot of outreach through local nonprofits. I would just sort of Google LGBTQ organization Kansas City. And I would email some of the people if they had contact information that worked there, asking for referrals that way. Some of those groups put me in their newsletters saying that I was coming to town and looking for subjects. I also was interviewed by a few publications where they wrote a little story about me and said that I was coming to town and looking for subjects, and got a lot of referrals that way. I also looked at groups on Facebook and even LinkedIn and Twitter that were regional but LGBTQ based, and found people that way and even posted messages there. So it really was like thousands of hours of work to find these subjects. And then there's a bunch of celebrities in the work as well. And for those people, a lot of them came from referrals, but for a lot of them, I would just blindly contact them. And that involved a lot of research because there's a lot of layers of people you have to go through, and typically
Sure.
any message doesn't really get to them. So I had to find a lot of creative ways to kind of reach people and be really persistent.
And how did you get to Alan Cummings? Such a dynamic personality, and a gorgeous shot, by the way, too. So.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I personally don't remember how I was referred to him, but I do recall that it was a referral from somebody.
Okay.
And he was so kind. I mean, I think he actually called me, if I remember, and just said, yeah, I'll do it, and was very informal, very approachable. Yeah, he's a really nice guy.
I noticed in the work as well, like it's not straight portraiture, because there's interactions and dynamics and things, and I commend you on choosing the environments, and there's so many interesting elements there and everything. But I'm curious about how you created that intimacy with your subject matter, because there are other stories happening there, and some of these people are strangers, and some of them are known to you, but that there's that level of intimacy between you and your subject matter, and I'm curious about the process that creates that for you.
Sure. So a lot of times a shoot would take anywhere between 2 and 4 hours. I would arrive at their home. Often there'd be 10 minutes of meet and greet. How are you? Where are you from? Nice to meet you. I would typically ask them to give me a tour of their home. And in hearing what they say, and in some of the little anecdotes about their home and some of the things in their home, sometimes I would get ideas that way of things that I thought would represent them or their life or their personality. Sometimes they would have suggestions of kind of places to do a shoot, but typically I would kind of suggest a setup. Then once I've spent 20 minutes or so setting up lights and equipment, and I'm usually actually pretty light on equipment, and I don't use an assistant, so that it's just me and them to create a more personal connection, because I feel like when there's an assistant behind the photographer, the subject is a little bit ill at ease. But once I'm kind of set up and start shooting, I just sort of talk to them as if I would meeting somebody at a cocktail party, and
Right.
ask them various questions. And I try to get them to forget that they're being shot. And a lot of times the more famous subjects would be completely comfortable in front of a camera and would have no problem being at ease. Sometimes there would be people that had never been shot by a professional photographer, and sometimes they would be nervous. So for them, it was particularly useful to just engage in dialogue and get them talking. And in so doing, they would often just sort of forget that they're being photographed. And that would allow me to get kind of everyday moments where their expressions felt real.
Yeah, and one of the pieces in the show, it was interesting because we were debating about like what the actual dialogue or the energy between the two subject matters were, because they were, it looked like you sort of felt like, oh, did we catch them at the end of a little argument, or were they having like some sort of like, discussion that required you to not be there? But even the environment itself was.
No, I do have a tendency to pick expressions and moments that are unusual, not always the most flattering either. So like in the case of Meredith Baxter, who was one of the stars from the 1980s sitcom, she was just telling me a story about one of her family members that was not the most positive story, and so that she had really like opened up and poured her heart out to me. So that's how I got that kind of deep, pensive expression. Other times people have kind of shared with me stories about their past or about what they're up to that have allowed me to just kind of get these unusual expressions.
Catch them right at that moment where they're not expecting it. Have they reflected back on the experience and the images that were produced into the book, and what do they say about it after the fact?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm lucky, I have them sign a release and then can choose the photo I want, and they see the image after it's released. Actually, I mean, I typically share it with them before to make sure they're comfortable with it. But a couple times people's agents or managers wanted to review the photos first. So that was always like a bit of a barrier, because they invariably would want photos of their subject smiling and being friendly. And those were not always the ones that I would choose. More than once, people did not want any of the photos. Coincidentally, those were often reality TV stars. I don't know why, but like I photographed Brad Goreski, where I actually flew there from New York to LA to photograph him. I thought the shoot was great, but he didn't like any of the pictures, so he wouldn't sign the release. Same with Carson Kressley. The first time I shot him, he didn't like his hair, I guess. So I didn't include any of them and reshot him. But sometimes there was a bit of a negotiation there about that. But typically the subjects would be fine with the images that I would choose, and they would typically be very delighted to see them.
Sure. And what do you hope the audience, the viewers, would take away from this particular series?
You know, beyond a celebration of difference and our diversity and all of that, I do want us to be accepted, but I feel like in most of society that has already happened and kind of started. I mean, I guess it started in the 60s and 70s, but really was crystallized in, I guess, the 90s. I also wanted people to accept us for who we are and accept us despite that many of us do have quirks and idiosyncrasies and differences. So sometimes I tried to celebrate our camp, our uniqueness, our difference, our kind of gay sensibility, which I think often is unique and you don't see as often in the straight community. So that was something I hoped people take away from the series. And then, yeah, just the breadth of who we are, all different professions, different walks of life, different backgrounds, different ages, different races, different geographies.
What kind of projects are you working on now and in the future, so that we can keep track of where you're going and be excited about that too?
Sure. I'm working on a series of kind of creative people at home. So it could be people in the media, journalists, it could be actors, it could be painters, it could be writers. So I'm always looking for referrals to people. They can find me at my website, tomatwood.com. So I have been continuing to photograph people at home, and it's a longer term project. It'll probably be a couple years before it comes out, but that's what I've been working on.
Wonderful, wonderful. I look forward to seeing that. We're so excited to have you in the show. Your work is getting great response from people, and I hope that it helps stimulate sales and more attention towards the projects that you're working on.
Thank you. It's a fantastic show, and I'm really delighted to be included.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you and I are in the same vein of you know, I really wanted stories to come forward that were not sort of the eros, you know, sort of sexuality of the gay community, but more about like who we are as individuals. And there's a huge diversity out there, just, you know, with stories who don't generally get to a platform on which to tell their story at this level. So I'm super excited to have you as a part of that too.
Great, likewise.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know that you have a lot going on, so thank you for taking the time to meet with me today, and hopefully you'll come to Mexico City and you can continue that series here in Mexico City as well.
I would love that. That would be fantastic, for sure.